The bell rang once at dawn, a sound thin as bone, and the fields answered with silence. That was when he appeared. Clean boots, pale coat, eyes the color of rain held too long. The young master stood on the porch as if the house had breathed him out overnight. No one bowed at first. No one moved. Faces froze in the half-light, each worker struck by the same shock, the same unholy recognition. It was not the finery that stilled them. It was the face. The plantation did not announce his arrival with trumpets or riders, only with the wrongness that crept through the morning like a chill that had no source. The sun rose as it always did, pale and reluctant, but the fields seemed to hold their breath when the carriage wheels stopped before the main house. Workers paused mid-motion, hands still buried in soil, eyes drawn upward by instinct rather than command. When the door opened and the young master stepped down, it was not his clothes that unsettled them, nor the way he carried himself with quiet authority, but the shock of recognition that struck like a blow to the chest. His face belonged to the land already. It had been seen in the quarters, in the fields, in the reflections of muddy water and cracked mirrors. It was the face of a boy who had once worked beside them, who had bled under the same sun, who had vanished years ago without a grave or farewell. Whispers moved faster than any order. Some said the dead had learned to walk again. Others believed the house had finally begun to repay its debts. An old man dropped to his knees, convinced he was witnessing judgment. Mothers pulled children closer, afraid of what it meant when the past returned wearing silk. The resemblance was exact enough to defy reason. The same narrow nose, the same dark lashes, the same faint mark near the jaw where a childhood fall had once drawn blood. Even the way he blinked, slow and thoughtful, matched the memory so perfectly it made the air feel thin. The house itself seemed to recognize him. Doors that usually groaned opened smoothly. The porch boards did not creak beneath his weight. Shadows aligned as he passed, as if rehearsed. He paused at the top of the steps and surveyed the land, not like a stranger claiming inheritance, but like someone returning to a place that had never let him go. His eyes lingered on the faces below, searching, measuring, remembering things he should not have known. Those who had shared bread with the lost boy felt their stomachs turn. Those who had struck him felt a different kind of fear, sharp and electric. The arrival did not feel like chance. It felt arranged, long delayed, precise. Somewhere behind the windows, the past stirred, and the plantation understood that this was not simply a master coming home, but a reckoning stepping quietly onto familiar ground. The words escaped before fear could catch them, torn loose by the unbearable pressure of recognition. It happened during roll call, when the overseer's voice cracked names like a whip and the workers stood in lines that never changed. The young master watched from the porch, his presence pressing down on the yard like a held breath. When his gaze drifted across the rows, it lingered too long on one face, and something in that look loosened a memory that had been locked away for survival. The slave who spoke was young, still carrying the dangerous belief that truth could exist without punishment. His brother's face had once been the only constant in a world designed to erase them, and now that face stood above him in clean clothes, alive and impossible. The question came out louder than intended, raw and unshaped by caution. It cut through the morning noise, stopping the murmurs, halting the shuffle of feet, even interrupting the birds that had been crying from the trees. For a brief moment, the plantation forgot how to breathe. The words did not accuse, did not demand. They simply existed, and that was enough. Every eye turned toward the speaker, not with solidarity, but with terror, because everyone understood what had just been done. A boundary older than memory had been crossed, not by rebellion, but by recognition. The overseer reacted before thought could form. His head snapped toward the voice, his face draining of color as if the question had pulled something vital out of him. He laughed, a sharp sound that did not belong in the air, and began speaking over the silence, insisting on coincidence, on foolishness, on the dangers of letting imagination rot the mind. His words stumbled over one another, each denial revealing more panic than authority. He moved quickly, placing himself between the young master and the man who had spoken, as though proximity alone could smother the truth. But the damage was done. The question had lodged itself in the yard, heavy and unmovable. It crawled into every ear, every thought. People who had never known the brother suddenly saw him clearly. Those who had known him felt his absence turn into a presence. The young master's expression did not harden as expected. Instead, it softened with something like curiosity or grief remembered too late. His eyes met the speaker's, and in that exchange passed a recognition deeper than blood, something shared without words. No punishment came immediately, which only deepened the fear. The plantation understood delays. It knew that when violence did not fall at once, it was only gathering shape. The question remained hanging in the air, unanswered, unchallenged, and impossible to erase. Changing the shape of the morning in ways no one yet understood, the overseer clung to denial the way a drowning man clings to driftwood, gripping it with a desperation that stripped his authority bare. He repeated the word coincidence as if it were a prayer, as if enough repetition could bend memory and flesh into obedience. He paced before the lines, boots scraping dirt, sweat gathering at his temples despite the cool morning. Every step he took seemed to tighten the invisible rope around his own throat. He spoke of distance, of years, of how faces often mirrored one another under the same sun, but his voice shook, and the lie announced itself in the rhythm of his breath. He refused to look directly at the young master, addressing instead the ground, the sky, the workers, anyone but the person whose presence unraveled him. When he did glance up, it was only for a second, long enough for the resemblance to strike him again with renewed force. The scar near the chin burned in his mind like a brand. He had seen that mark before, had been there when it was made, when a boy stumbled against a broken fence and cried without sound so as not to invite attention. The memory surged up unbidden, and he swallowed hard, tasting iron. To regain control, the overseer lashed out where he always had. He barked orders, threatened lashes, reminded everyone of their place. His hand hovered near his whip, not in readiness but in comfort, a familiar weight meant to steady him. Yet even the whip felt foreign now, insufficient against what had been spoken into existence. The workers stood rigid, eyes lowered, though many could feel the truth humming just beneath their skin. They knew denial when they heard it. They had lived inside it their entire lives. Privately, the overseer's mind spiraled. He replayed old nights, old decisions, the bargains struck in whispers and shadows. He remembered a woman dragged from the quarters, her screams swallowed by distance. He remembered 2 infants born where only one was meant to exist, and the problem that had created. He had told himself it was mercy, that separation was survival, that one life traded for another could balance the scales. Standing in the yard now, faced with the living consequence of those choices, his certainty rotted away. The young master said nothing, which was worse than accusation. His silence pressed against the overseer's chest, forcing his heart to race. It felt as though the land itself was watching, measuring the space between lie and truth. The overseer sensed that denial would not save him, yet he could not let it go, because beyond denial waited a reckoning with no language gentle enough to survive it. The ledger was never meant to be found, which was why it survived. It lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the office, wrapped in oilcloth darkened by years of handling, the pages swollen from damp and secrecy. The overseer had forgotten it in the way men forget sins they believe time has buried for them. It surfaced only because the house itself seemed to shift after the question was asked, as if walls loosened their grip on what they had been holding. A young clerk, sent to fetch an old deed, noticed the uneven plank and pried it up with careless curiosity, uncovering a weight that felt heavier than paper should. The names inside were written in a careful hand, neat and precise, but many were crossed out, scratched so hard the ink tore through the page. Dates followed the names, then places, then short notes that avoided detail while confessing everything. Twin births appeared more than once, always followed by a correction, a revision that reduced 2 to 1. Payments were listed alongside them, not wages but compensations, measured in grain, coin, and favors. There were initials at the margins, repeated often enough to become unmistakable, marking approval from someone higher than the overseer had ever admitted to answering to. As the pages turned, a pattern emerged that made the room feel smaller. Children born too close together, children born to women who disappeared soon after, children reassigned, relocated, erased. Some entries ended with a single word that explained nothing and everything: removed. The ledger did not record deaths, because death was not the truth. It recorded transactions, the movement of flesh treated as excess, the quiet solutions to inconvenient bloodlines. Each line was an attempt to impose order on something that should never have been controlled. When the name of the lost boy appeared, the ink was lighter, as if the pen had hesitated. Next to it was another name, almost identical, followed by the word retained. The difference between them amounted to a single decision made in the dark. The overseer's signature followed, cramped and hurried, betraying the fear that had guided his hand even then. It became clear that the ledger was not merely a record but a confession written over years by someone who believed paper could absorb guilt the way soil absorbs blood. By the time the ledger reached the young master's hands, its weight had changed. It was no longer evidence waiting to be interpreted. It was memory given form, a bridge between what had been done and what had returned. As he read, his expression did not shift into anger or shock. Instead, a slow understanding settled into his features, the kind that comes from learning a truth your body has known all along. And somewhere deep within the house, the floorboards settled back into place as if its purpose had finally been fulfilled. The lullaby began as a tremor in the air, so faint it might have been mistaken for the wind slipping through the trees, but those who recognized it felt their breath catch all the same. The old woman sat near the quarters where she had always sat, her back curved by years of labor and loss, her eyes clouded, yet seeing more than most. She had not spoken during the morning's upheaval, had not lifted her head when the question was asked, but now the song rose from her chest as naturally as breath. It was a melody passed in whispers, learned in darkness, meant only for nights when grief grew too loud to bear. The tune carried a history no ledger could hold. It had been sung to children born without promises, to infants who needed comfort more than names. Each note was shaped by survival, by the careful balance between love and silence. As the sound drifted across the yard, workers froze again, not in fear this time, but in recognition of something sacred. The overseer stiffened, his eyes darting toward the woman as if she had drawn a blade. He knew the song. He had ordered it silenced years ago, when it had been used to soothe two crying infants instead of one. What no one expected was the young master's reaction. His head turned slowly toward the sound, his body responding before his mind could intervene. His lips parted, and when the woman reached the pause in the melody, the place where the words always ended unfinished, he spoke. He finished the verse softly, his voice steady, carrying the final line with a familiarity that stunned the yard into stillness. The words were not common, not something learned by chance. They belonged to a single family, to a single night repeated in memory until it etched itself into the soul. The old woman looked up then, her eyes clearing as if the years fell away. Her hands trembled, not with age but with recognition. She saw in him not the master's coat, not the authority he wore, but the child she had once rocked while another was taken screaming into the dark. Her song faltered, broke, then resumed with tears threading through the notes. The yard felt suddenly too small to hold what was unfolding, as though the past had stepped fully into the present and refused to be ignored. The overseer backed away, shaking his head, muttering about coincidence again, but the words sounded hollow now, stripped of power. The lullaby had crossed a boundary denial could not repair. It carried proof older than ink, written into muscle and memory, and as the final note faded, the truth settled over the plantation with the weight of something that had waited far too long to be heard. The night did not arrive naturally after that day. It was summoned, heavy and deliberate, as if the land itself had called for judgment. No torches were lit at first. People gathered by instinct rather than command, drawn toward the open space near the old tree where meetings were never officially held but always remembered. The overseer was brought there not by force, but by the absence of resistance around him. Every path he tried to take seemed to close before he reached it, not with bodies, but with silence. This was not a trial recognized by any law written on paper. It belonged to the estate, to its long memory and its unspoken rules. No accusations were read aloud. They did not need to be. The ledger lay open on a rough table, its pages fluttering slightly in the night air, catching moonlight like pale scars. The lullaby still echoed in many minds, more convincing than any testimony. Faces emerged from the dark, workers, elders, those who had endured long enough to become witnesses by survival alone. They did not shout. They did not threaten. Their quiet attention pressed harder than violence ever could. The overseer felt it settle on his shoulders, bending him forward inch by inch. At first he laughed again, that same brittle sound, insisting there had been procedures, permissions, necessities. He spoke of order, of protection, of how chaos would have followed had he not acted. His words spilled out faster, tripping over one another, until they began to reveal more than he intended. Dates slipped from his mouth. Names he had meant to erase returned in fragments. He spoke of choices made to please those above him, of instructions delivered without signatures, of children divided so bloodlines would not complicate inheritance. The confession took shape not as an admission of guilt, but as a desperate attempt to justify survival at any cost. The young master listened from the edge of the gathering, his face unreadable. He did not interrupt, did not accuse. His presence alone seemed to anchor the night, giving it purpose. When the overseer finally fell silent, breath ragged, waiting for someone to save him, no voice rose in his defense. The elders exchanged glances, brief and final. The decision had been made long before this night arrived, written into the soil with every buried truth. What followed was swift and ritualized, carried out with the same grim efficiency that had once enforced the overseer's rule. He was not dragged away screaming. He wept, softly, as though mourning the life he believed had justified everything else. As the first light of dawn began to thin the darkness, the plantation stood witness, understanding that this was not revenge, but balance being restored in the only language the land still recognized. Dawn broke slowly, as if reluctant to look upon what had been arranged beneath the old tree. The air carried a strange stillness, thick and watchful, and the ground felt colder there than anywhere else on the estate. The tree stood apart from the others, its branches twisted into shapes that resembled reaching hands, its bark scarred by marks no one spoke of aloud. They said it remembered faces, that every soul brought beneath it left an impression the wood never released. Whether superstition or truth, no one doubted its authority. When the overseer was led forward, the rope already waited, pale against the dark trunk, patient as the land itself. He stumbled once, then steadied, eyes fixed on the ground as if refusing to give the tree his face. The people gathered at a distance, not in celebration, not in horror, but in grim acceptance. This was not a spectacle meant to entertain or warn. It was a sentence carried out because something older than law demanded completion. The birds were silent. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. The rope was placed around his neck with careful hands, the same carefulness he had once reserved for ledgers and transactions, and that familiarity broke him at last. He tried to speak, to offer final words that might reshape the story of his life, but sound failed him. His gaze lifted involuntarily and met the young master's across the clearing. In that brief exchange, understanding passed between them. The overseer saw not just accusation, but inheritance, the living consequence of choices he had signed away with ink and fear. The young master did not look away. His expression held no triumph, only a quiet resolve that felt heavier than anger. When the signal was given, it was almost imperceptible, a slight nod from one of the elders. The ground beneath the overseer dropped away, and the rope snapped taut with a sound too sharp for the morning. No one flinched. They had learned long ago that flinching did not change outcomes. The tree absorbed the moment, its branches shuddering faintly as if adjusting to the weight. Shadows shifted across the clearing, and for a heartbeat it seemed as though the bark itself tightened, sealing the act into its memory. As the sun finally cleared the horizon, light fell across the overseer's still form, stripping away any remaining illusion of power. The plantation exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition that something had been concluded. The tree stood unchanged, indifferent and eternal, yet those who looked upon it swore later that its silhouette had altered, that among the knots and scars a new shape had appeared, resembling a face caught mid-confession, condemned to remain there as long as the land chose to remember the estate did not change hands with ceremony or announcement. It simply adjusted itself, like a body accommodating a new weight. The young master took possession without raising his voice, without issuing proclamations. Papers were signed quietly, keys exchanged without flourish. Those who expected punishment or mercy found neither offered openly. What settled over the land instead was silence, thick and deliberate, an inheritance passed more effectively than any title. The workers noticed it first in small ways. The bell rang later. The overseer's whip remained locked away. The house lights burned longer into the night, as if searching for something that refused to appear. The young master walked the grounds often alone. He visited the quarters without escort, stood near the well where songs had once been cut short, traced his fingers along fences that had drawn blood years before. People felt his presence more than they heard it. He asked few questions, but when he did, they reached deep, pulling memories to the surface that many had survived by burying. Some spoke, others could not. He never pressed. He understood silence not as absence, but as a language shaped by endurance. Yet the resemblance did not fade. If anything, it grew stronger. In certain light, at certain angles, it was no longer clear which brother the land was looking at. Children whispered that the dead one walked twice now, once in memory and once in flesh. Elders avoided saying his name, afraid that naming might fracture what fragile balance had been restored. The young master himself began to notice things he could not explain, dreams that did not feel like dreams, aches in places where no injury existed, a familiarity with paths he did not remember learning. The ledger was sealed away, not destroyed. The lullaby was sung again, openly this time, though always softly, as if the air itself demanded respect. The tree remained standing, untouched, its shadow a constant reminder that justice here did not belong to courts or crowns. The workers understood that power had not disappeared, only changed shape. It no longer shouted. It listened. What lingered most was the question that had begun everything. It was never answered aloud, never officially acknowledged, yet it threaded through every interaction, every glance exchanged across the fields. Why did the young master look exactly like the lost brother? The estate carried that question forward, embedding it into its future, ensuring it would not be forgotten even as years passed and faces changed, because some truths, once spoken, refused to remain in the past and instead choose to rule quietly, shaping generations through the weight of what can never again be denied.